May 1945, an airfield in Western Europe. The war is over. Engines that once roared daily now sit silent on the tarmac. Rows of aircraft line the runway, paint faded, metal scarred by thousands of hours in hostile skies. Among them stands the P-51 Mustang, its long wings stretched beneath a calm sky it helped secure. Just weeks earlier, these fighters had ruled the air. They had escorted bombers deep into Germany. They had broken the Luftwaffe's resistance. They had turned air superiority from a contested struggle into a certainty. Pilots climb down from cockpits for the last time. Some touch the fuselage as they walk away. Others do not look back at all. Victory has arrived quickly. So has uncertainty. The Mustang was built for war. It thrived in pursuit, endurance, and dominance. But peace asks different questions. Budgets shrink. Priorities shift. New technologies emerge faster than old ones can adapt. The aircraft that helped win the air war now waits, its future undecided, its purpose unclear. For those who flew it and those who planned around it, the question is no longer whether the P-51 was successful. The question is what happens to a weapon designed for total war when the war suddenly ends. To understand how the Mustang reached this moment and why its post-war fate was anything but certain, we must return to the conditions that made it indispensable in the first place. Before the P-51 Mustang ever symbolized victory, it was born out of urgency and doubt. In 1940, Britain stood alone against Germany. The Royal Air Force needed fighters, quickly. American manufacturers responded, but few designs impressed British evaluators. One proposal, however, showed promise, not because it was exceptional, but because it could be produced fast. That aircraft would become the Mustang. At first, expectations were modest. Early versions of the P-51 were not yet legendary. At low altitude, they performed well. At high altitude, where the air war over Europe would ultimately be decided, they struggled. Range was adequate, but not revolutionary. Power was limited. No one yet imagined the Mustang as the aircraft that would break the Luftwaffe. What changed everything was a decision born from experimentation rather than certainty. The installation of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine transformed the Mustang. High-altitude performance improved dramatically. Speed increased, climb rate improved. Most importantly, range and efficiency combined in a way no other Allied fighter could match. By 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a crisis point. American bombers were flying deep into German territory, but without continuous fighter escort. Losses were severe. Crews were dying not because missions failed, but because protection ended too soon. The Mustang solved that problem. With external fuel tanks and unmatched endurance, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and stay. It did not merely chase enemy fighters away, it hunted them. It forced engagement, it denied the Luftwaffe recovery time. German pilots noticed quickly, Luftwaffe command noticed even faster. The balance of the air war began to tilt, not through a single battle, but through relentless pressure. Each mission degraded German strength further. Each escort denied Germany the chance to rebuild its fighter force. The Mustang did not win the air war overnight, it won it systematically. And by early 1944, as Allied planners prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, air superiority was no longer a goal, it was an assumption. That assumption would shape the final year of the war and define the Mustang's place in history, setting the stage for the moment when dominance turned into victory. By the time Allied forces crossed into 1944, the P-51 Mustang had become more than a fighter. It was a system, an aircraft integrated into a strategy designed to exhaust the enemy in the air before defeating him on the ground. German fighter strength was collapsing, not from a single defeat, but from sustained pressure. Pilots were being lost faster than they could be trained. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Aircraft production struggled to replace losses. The Luftwaffe was being worn down in a war of attrition it could not win. The Mustang was central to that attrition. Its range allowed escorts to remain with bombers from takeoff to landing. German fighters could no longer wait for vulnerable moments. Engagement became unavoidable. Every interception risked permanent loss. American doctrine adapted quickly. P-51 units were authorized to range ahead of bomber formations, sweeping airfields, rail lines, and supply routes. They attacked aircraft on the ground, they disrupted logistics. They forced German pilots into defensive postures that eroded confidence and effectiveness. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe faced a grim reality. Air superiority over Western Europe was gone. The skies belonged to the Allies. The Mustang had done what no previous fighter could, combine speed, range, altitude performance, and reliability at scale. It allowed the United States to project air power continuously, not episodically. It turned bombing from a gamble into a sustained campaign. Victory followed. But even as the P-51 reached the height of its effectiveness, forces beyond the battlefield were already moving. Jet technology was advancing, budgets were being reviewed.
Military planners were asking new questions about the future of air combat. The aircraft that had dominated piston-engine warfare was approaching the moment when war would no longer define its purpose. And when the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Mustang's greatest challenge was no longer the Luftwaffe, but uncertainty itself. That uncertainty would shape how pilots, commanders, and governments reassess the aircraft that had helped win the war. And it would frame the next phase of the story, seen through multiple angles, each revealing a different consequence of victory. Angle 1. The human cost of air superiority. For the pilots who flew the P-51, victory was not abstract. It was personal, physical, and often exhausting. Escort missions could last 6 or 7 hours. Cold crept into cockpits. Oxygen systems hissed steadily. Fatigue became a constant companion long before enemy aircraft appeared. By 1944, many pilots had survived dozens of missions. They had watched squadrons thin out. They had learned that air superiority did not mean safety, only survival long enough to fight again tomorrow. When the war ended, this reality collided with peace. Pilots returned home carrying experience that no longer had a clear place. The aircraft that had defined their identity as combat aviators suddenly became a relic of a conflict the world was eager to leave behind. Angle 2. Tactical perfection at the wrong moment. From a tactical standpoint, the Mustang reached near perfection at precisely the moment it risked becoming obsolete. It was fast, reliable, long-ranged, and deadly in the hands of trained pilots. Yet air combat doctrine was already shifting. Jets promised speed beyond propellers. Radar-guided interception changed engagement geometry. The qualities that made the P-51 dominant, range, endurance, efficiency, were less central in a post-war world preparing for different threats. The Mustang had mastered one kind of war completely. Peace demanded preparation for another. Angle 3. Enemy recognition in post-war silence. German pilots who survived the war acknowledged the P-51's impact with reluctant clarity. It denied them choice, it denied them recovery, it denied them time. Yet after 1945, that fear evaporated almost instantly. There were no enemies left to challenge the Mustang's dominance. Without opposition, its legend risked fading into memory rather than evolving into relevance. Victory had removed the context that made the aircraft indispensable. As these human, tactical, and psychological realities settled in, the Mustang's future became increasingly uncertain, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too completely for a world that was already moving on. Angle 4. Leadership and the burden of success. For Allied commanders, the P-51 presented an unexpected problem after victory. It had performed exactly as hoped, perhaps too well. The aircraft had validated a doctrine built around long-range escort and attrition, but doctrine does not stand still. With the war over, leadership faced shrinking budgets and expanding responsibilities. Occupation duties replaced combat operations, strategic focus shifted toward deterrence rather than destruction. In that environment, an aircraft optimized for escorting best bomber formations over hostile territory no longer fit cleanly. Keeping the Mustang meant committing resources to a war that had already ended. Angle 5. Technology moving faster than legacy.
Faster than legacy. The jet age arrived without sentiment. Aircraft like the P-51 were measured not against what they had achieved, but against what was coming next. Jets promised altitude, speed, and interception capability that piston-engine fighters could not match. The Mustang did not suddenly become ineffective, it became outpaced by expectation. Development timelines accelerated, research funding followed novelty. The aircraft that had once represented the future now occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, still capable, still reliable, but no longer the answer to tomorrow's questions. Angle 6. Moral weight of a proven weapon. There was also a quieter reckoning. The P-51 had helped enable the strategic bombing campaign that devastated German cities and infrastructure. Its success was inseparable from destruction on a massive scale. In peacetime, that association mattered. Celebration gave way to reflection. A weapon designed to dominate skies over enemy territory had limited symbolic value in a world trying to rebuild. The Mustang's achievements were honored, but its continued presence raised questions about the kind of future nations wanted to prepare for. As these angles converged, human, tactical, technological, and moral, the Mustang stood at a crossroads. Its wartime identity was secure, its peacetime purpose was not. And with that tension unresolved, the story moves toward the moment when victory gave way to transition, and the aircraft's fate was decided not in combat, but in policy and planning. The turning point for the P-51 did not arrive with a crash, a defeat, or a dramatic failure. It arrived in conference rooms, budget hearings, and planning documents. Quiet decisions that carried enormous consequence. In late 1945, the United States military began reshaping itself for a world no longer defined by total war. Millions of servicemen were demobilized, wartime production lines slowed or stopped altogether. Aircraft that had been built in the tens of thousands suddenly had no enemy to fight. The Mustang was everywhere. Airfields across Europe and the United States were crowded with P-51s, some nearly new, others worn thin by combat. Maintenance crews kept them operational out of habit as much as necessity. Pilots continued to fly them in training and patrol roles, even as leadership questioned how long that would make sense. At the same time, jet aircraft were no longer experimental curiosities. They were flying, they were improving, and they were absorbing attention. The P-51 was still effective, still respected, but effectiveness was no longer enough. Strategic planners asked hard questions. Could a piston-engine fighter remain relevant in a world preparing for jet combat? Should resources be spent upgrading an aircraft built for a war that had already passed? Or should the Mustang's legacy be preserved by letting it step aside at its peak? There was no single answer. Different commands reached different conclusions. Some Mustangs were retained for air defense and training. Others were earmarked for foreign allies rebuilding their own air forces. Many were simply parked, waiting for a decision that never came. This was the moment when the P-51's fate shifted from certainty to ambiguity. It was no longer defined by mission urgency. It was defined by transition. And as that transition deepened, the aircraft that had dominated the skies faced its most consequential test, not against an enemy, but against time itself. The turning point for the P-51 did not arrive with a crash, a defeat, or dramatic failure. It arrived in conference rooms, budget hearings, and planning documents. Quiet decisions that carried enormous consequence. In late 1945, the United States military began reshaping itself for a world no longer defined by total war. Millions of servicemen were demobilized, wartime production lines slowed or stopped altogether. Aircraft that had been built in the tens of thousands suddenly had no enemy to fight. The Mustang was everywhere. Airfields across Europe and the United States were crowded with P-51s, some nearly new, others worn thin by combat. Maintenance crews kept them operational out of habit as much as necessity. Pilots continued to fly them in training and patrol rules, even as leadership questioned how long that would make sense. At the same time, jet aircraft were no longer experimental curiosities. They were flying, they were improving, and they were absorbing attention. The P-51 was still effective, still respected, but effectiveness was no longer enough. Strategic planners asked hard questions. Could a piston-engine fighter remain relevant in a world preparing for jet combat? Should resources be spent upgrading an aircraft built for a war that had already passed? Or should the Mustang's legacy be preserved by letting it step aside at its peak? There was no single answer. Different commands reached different conclusions. Some Mustangs were retained for air defense and training. Others were earmarked for foreign allies rebuilding their own air forces. Many were simply parked, waiting for a decision that never came. This was the moment when the P-51's fate shifted from certainty to ambiguity. It was no longer defined by mission urgency. It was defined by transition. And as that transition deepened, the aircraft that had dominated the skies faced its most consequential test, not against an enemy, but against time itself. The turning point for the P-51 did not arrive with a crash, a defeat, or a dramatic failure. It arrived in conference rooms, budget hearings, and planning documents. Quiet decisions that carried enormous consequence. In late 1945, the United States military began reshaping itself for a world no longer defined by total war. Millions of servicemen were demobilized, wartime production lines slowed or stopped altogether. Aircraft that had been built in the tens of thousands suddenly had no enemy to fight. The Mustang was everywhere. Airfields across Europe and the United States were crowded with P-51s, some nearly new, others worn thin by combat. Maintenance crews kept them operational out of habit as much as necessity. Pilots continued to fly them in training and patrol roles, even as leadership questioned how long that would make sense. At the same time, jet aircraft were no longer experimental curiosities. They were flying, they were improving, and they were absorbing attention. The P-51 was still effective, still respected, but effectiveness was no longer enough. Strategic planners asked hard questions. Could a piston-engine fighter remain relevant in a world preparing for jet combat? Should resources be spent upgrading an aircraft built for a war that had already passed? Or should the Mustang's legacy be preserved by letting it step aside at its peak? There was no single answer. Different commands reached different conclusions. Some Mustangs were retained for air defense and training. Others were earmarked for foreign allies rebuilding their own air forces. Many were simply parked, waiting for a decision that never came. This was the moment when the P-51's fate shifted from certainty to ambiguity. It was no longer defined by mission urgency. It was defined by transition. And as that transition deepened, the aircraft that had dominated the skies faced its most consequential test, not against an enemy, but against time itself. By 1946, the answer was becoming clear. Not through declaration, but through momentum. Jet programs advanced rapidly. The logic was irresistible. Speed promised interception dominance. Altitude promised survivability. The future of air combat was being imagined at velocities the Mustang could never reach, no matter how refined its design. The P-51 was evaluated again and again. Test data was solid, reliability remained excellent, operational costs were manageable. In a vacuum, it was still one of the finest fighters ever built. But air power does not exist in a vacuum. Budgets favored innovation. Training pipelines shifted towards jets. Doctrine rewrote itself around radar, interception, and deterrence, rather than escort and attrition. The Mustang's defining strength, long-range escort, was no longer central to strategy. Gradually, decisions aligned.
The P-51 was reassigned, redistributed, or retired. Hundreds were transferred to Allied nations rebuilding their own air forces. Others entered the Air National Guard. Some were sold as surplus. Many were stored, dismantled, or scrapped. There was no ceremony. The aircraft that had escorted bombers to Berlin and hunted the Luftwaffe into collapse faded from frontline service without resistance, not because it had failed, but because the world it was built for had disappeared. For pilots and commanders alike, the transition carried quiet weight. Victory had not guaranteed permanence. Mastery of one era had not secured relevance in the next. The Mustang's exit marked a deeper shift in warfare. It was the end of piston-engine dominance, the close of an age defined by propellers, endurance, and visual combat. As the P-51 slipped into history, the consequences of its departure began to ripple outward, shaping air forces, alliances, and memory itself. And in that space between triumph and obsolescence, the true aftermath of victory finally emerged. In the years immediately following the war, the P-51 Mustang entered a strange second life, one defined not by dominance, but by redistribution. Air forces around the world needed aircraft quickly. Europe was rebuilding, new nations were forming, old alliances were being tested. The Mustang, proven and plentiful, became a solution to many problems it had never been designed to solve. Hundreds of P-51s were transferred to Allied and partner nations. They flew in foreign colors across Europe, Latin America, and Asia. In these air forces, the Mustang was no longer a symbol of victory, but of continuity, a bridge between wartime experience and peacetime necessity. For the United States, this redistribution served a purpose. It extended influence without direct presence. It allowed allies to maintain air power without massive investment. The Mustang became a diploma as much as a military one. At home, the aircraft found a place in the Air National Guard and reserve units. Pilots trained on a machine they trusted. Maintenance crews worked with familiar systems. For a time, it seemed the Mustang might remain relevant simply because it was reliable. But beneath that surface, change continued. Jets redefined expectations. Speeds doubled. Altitudes climbed. Engagements moved beyond visual range. The Mustang's strengths, range, efficiency, handling mattered less with each passing year. The aircraft was not failing, it was being overtaken. And as newer designs claimed attention and funding, the Mustang's role narrowed further. It remained useful, but no longer essential. Familiarity delayed its departure, but could not prevent it. For those who had flown it in combat, this transition was difficult to accept. The aircraft that had once carried life and death significance was now treated as surplus. Victory had preserved it, but peace had diminished its purpose. As the Mustang continued to fade from active service, its legacy began to separate from its
utility, shifting from a weapon of war to an artifact of memory. By the early 1950s, the transformation was complete. The P-51 Mustang was no longer a frontline instrument of American air power. It had become something else entirely, distributed, remembered, and increasingly symbolic. In some nations, the Mustang flew briefly in combat again, pressed into service during regional conflicts where jets were scarce or impractical. In others, it served quietly, training pilots or patrolling borders that no longer resembled the skies of 1944. Each role extended its life, but none restored its centrality. Within the United States, the aircraft's presence diminished steadily. Jets dominated procurement and doctrine. Training pipelines no longer emphasized piston-engine mastery. The skills that had defined Mustang pilots, long-range navigation, escort endurance, visual combat, gave way to new priorities shaped by speed, radar, and nuclear deterrence. The P-51's retirement was not marked by loss, but by replacement. Airfields that once echoed with the Mustang's engine note grew quieter. Some aircraft were preserved. Others were sold to civilians, repurposed for racing or display. Many were dismantled, their materials absorbed into a post-war economy eager to move forward. Yet even as the aircraft disappeared from service, its reputation did not fade. Veterans spoke of it with precision and restraint. Historians measured its impact not by aesthetics or nostalgia, but by outcomes. The air war over Europe had turned when the Mustang arrived. That fact endured. The aircraft's post-war fate revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare. Success does not guarantee longevity. A weapon can be decisive and still temporary. Victory accelerates change, rather than preserving the tools that achieved it. By the time the Mustang fully exited active military service, it had already secured something more durable than relevance. It had secured meaning. And with its operational story complete, what remained was the question of how history would remember an aircraft that mastered its moment, only to find that moments, like wars, do not last forever. The story of the P-51 Mustang is often told as a triumph of engineering and courage, and rightly so. It arrived when the air war demanded endurance, precision, and reach, and it delivered all three with decisive effect. The skies over Europe changed because the Mustang made them change. But history rarely stops at victory. When peace arrived, the P-51 faced a truth shared by many instruments of war. Success does not protect against irrelevance. The qualities that made it indispensable in 1944 were shaped by a specific moment, one defined by bomber streams, visual combat, and attrition fought mile after mile through hostile airspace. When that moment passed, the world asked different questions. The Mustang did not fail those questions. It simply wasn't built to answer them. Its quiet departure from frontline service reflects something larger than technology. It reflects how modern warfare accelerates its own replacement. The better a weapon performs, the faster it pushes doctrine, industry, and imagination forward, often beyond itself. In that sense, the P-51's uncertain peace was not a dismissal, but a confirmation. It had done its job completely. It had mastered its era so thoroughly that it helped make that era obsolete. Today, the Mustang endures not because it lasted longest, but because it mattered most when it was needed. Its legacy is not found in continued service, but in the silence it left behind. The silence of skies no longer contested, of enemies no longer able to rise to meet it. The P-51 did not fade because it was forgotten. It faded because it had already won.